Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. I'm honored to be here with you all and very much honored to have the opportunity to moderate this esteemed panel of leaders in government, academia, and the global financial sector. So thank you very much for joining us today. As you all know, our panel is here to explore the topic of a new hope, navigating economic turbulence and uncovering opportunities. This is a complicated task given the current global economic conditions and the volatile state of the financial markets. Nevertheless, we are very fortunate to have a group of panelists here with the experience and vision necessary to help us identify opportunities as we look through the cycle. Before we get started, let me set the stage for our conversation. And as we've heard from our conversations earlier today, obviously a very, very tough backdrop in the global markets, the global economy, driven by various events over the last several years. And I'll give you a bit of sense of where we're going with the conversation and how I describe what's happened in our backdrop. We are nearly 3 years on from the start of the global pandemic and now 7 months into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The pandemic set in motion significant economic upheaval, driven by lockdowns and disruption of global supply chains. Meanwhile, governments across the world looked inward, pressured to respond to the needs and demands of citizens to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on their livelihoods. In many cases, particularly in the developed world, these responses took shape as fiscal stimuli or continued easy monetary policy. These policies, aimed at sustaining economic activity and providing consumers with incremental liquidity, ran headfirst into severe supply shortages of everything from basic goods to cutting-edge technological inputs. This caused an inflationary shock, which at the time and from several months thereafter was viewed by many to be transitory in nature. By late 2021, there was a glimmer of hope that the supply constraints and associated inflationary pressures in the world would abate. The world economy also at that time appeared poised to recover from the low points of the pandemic, although the recovery was setting up to be staggered and uneven, particularly across the emerging markets. But then, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, igniting another round of supply shocks, specifically in the critical areas of food and energy. This second shock wave effectively hypercharged global inflation and set off a frantic scramble to secure those critical commodities. Meanwhile, China was zeroing in on its zero COVID policy, further weakening its domestic economic outlook with important ramifications for the global economy. And now the world is contending with a number of very, very difficult issues. These include multi-decade high inflation, with central banks around the world rushing to restore price stability with aggressive monetary policy tightening, another downturn in the global economy, with certain recession in Europe and the US likely to follow behind, energy and food security crises in various regions around the world, the financial costs, as well as the political and social demands to create resilient and safe supply chains quickly, and last but certainly not least, accelerating climate change and the imperative to achieve a green transition against this very, very challenging backdrop. And on that note, let's now turn to our panel. And we'll run through some questions and get a global perspective and then spend some time honing in on Asia, Japan, and talk a bit about climate change and the green transition. So let's start with Governor Hayashi. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'd all benefit from hearing your perspective on the appropriate policy responses to dealing with stubbornly high inflation, which the world is experiencing right now. We'd appreciate if you would share your thoughts on what those appropriate policy responses should look like at this time.
Well, thank you very much, Celeste, and thank you for your terrific scene setting. Well, I would start out by saying there's been too much fiscal policy, too much monetary policy. Economic policy, as you know, has a positive side and a negative one. So by stimulating demand, You can buy time, but you'll pay a price later. The price we are paying in Japan is a huge government debt. And the price the US is paying is the Fed is faced with billions of trillions of dollars of excess reserve. So you put on the brakes with high interest, but the brake is not as effective as you might thought. What I would stress is to invest in the supply side. While take energy crisis, we should have invested really on renewable energy, but also we should have invested more on gas, because gas is needed for today and tomorrow, and especially for Asian country who still has to grow. Transition from coal to gas is a very essential move toward carbon neutrality. And when we support, well, we are finding more and more unique in funding LNG upstream among our official agencies. But we do that in accordance with G7 agreement and in alignment with Paris Agreement. I was in Hanoi a couple of weeks ago and talked with Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, and they do have a plan to be carbon neutral before 2050. And also they have an ambitious goal to be a high-income country before 2045. So they need a lot of investment in energy. So while we support their gas development and gas power development, we support them with renewable energy, support them with CCS, support them with energy efficiency, and also with hydrogen and ammonia, a new generation energy. So what I want to say is that such infrastructure has to be planned and financed in a very long term. And so we want to support those countries in a very long and holistic perspective so that those countries can grow, develop their industry, and better the life of ordinary people. So you have to address those crises, energy, food, and climate crisis, but you also have to be a long-term thinker and invest in supply side.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And with that, what role do you envision JBIC playing in terms of specific areas of investment from JBIC's perspective to help bring down inflation over the longer term, beyond the renewable space and any other areas where you see productivity or enhanced or driving efficiencies?
Well, at present, it's energy, yeah, and also supply chain.
Right.
And we do that with, together with the US, Australia, and like-minded people in the framework of IPEF. We are starting to work on.
Right, thank you. And moving beyond inflation and really now discussing more of the global economic backdrop, I welcome your thoughts, Mana-san, yes, on sort of your big picture view of the global economy. Really the big question is, where do we go from here?
Yes. Thank you, Celeste, and hello, everyone. I think it's time for sleeping, right, after the lunch. But we would like to talk about the very interesting panels. So please keep your eyes. And first of all, thank you very much, everyone. And as for the overall picture of the world economy, in a nutshell, I think it's about the stagflation of Europe and the US and how it will affect the world. It can be said that the rising prices around the world and the supply chain risks caused by the Russia-Ukraine invasion had an impact on changes in monetary policy. Originally, it was thought that the world would change its monetary policy and move towards normalization with the end of the COVID-19. But this has accelerated. Rising interest rates are healthy if we were in a good economy, but the problem is that they are likely to lead to stagflation, partly because they have affected supply. Especially in Europe, which is prominent in Germany, what should be done about the energy mix? They are facing very big difficulties, to tell the truth. Moreover, the political system is undergoing dramatic changes, such as the recent inauguration of Prime Minister Truss in the United Kingdom and the possibility that Ms. Meloni will become Prime Minister in Italy. The common thread is that there is a strong possibility that fiscal policy will expand again, including price measures and tax cuts. Fiscal factors may shake the global economy. In any case, the monetary policy hike may be offset by fiscal policy easing for the time being. but it is only a matter of time before the stagflation risk becomes apparent. In addition, some emerging countries are facing the triple whammy. One is rising US rates, and two, not improving the Chinese economy as much as our expectation. Three, continuing price hikes. And the credit risks have begun to materialize in some countries. Sri Lanka has defaulted, but I think that there will be other countries that are struggling with economic conditions and debt restructuring. Of course, amid rising crude oil prices, we should keep an eye on variations such as oil-producing countries stabilizing for the time being. Based on this, it seems likely that the global economy will enter a rather negative situation from here on out and become fragile. So at this point, I would recommend investors to invest in sovereign and companies with strong fundamentals and investment that seem to deviate from default risk. I would like to talk more and more, however, I stop here. Let's start with it as a kickoff.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And Akash, following on from the comments we've heard thus far, I mean, it's obvious we're facing significant economic disruption in the world, and with that heightened market risk, and certainly we see it every day in volatility across asset classes. Meanwhile, we see this ongoing evolution of the global financial markets. In your role as Chief Growth Officer at BNY Mellon, you have a view into almost every aspect of the global financial markets on a daily basis. What do you see in that role as sort of the key trend shaping the global financial markets from here?
No, thank you, Celeste. And this is my second time back in Japan in the last 6 months, and it's great to be back and to spend this time with this illustrious group. Look, the world's financial markets are in dislocation. There's no doubt about it. But I would say one emerging theme that is very clear, and it also goes back to the earlier conversations today, is I do believe financial services will remain the one true global business and the world's most interconnected part of the economy. So I stay quite optimistic about that. And there are a few reasons for it, and I think there are a few trends in this market that I believe will sort of persist through this period of crisis and emerge on the other side. I think number one is there is still an abundance of capital, though it is dislocated. And here, this is obviously the surge in new investors that have come into the market around the world, particularly from retail investors, to the rise of private capital and private markets, which today are still in a relatively unformed version of themselves. And we believe that that ability to form capital and deploy will only get better. The second is that there are great demands on that capital that will require the interests of governments, private sector, and the social sector to come together in big ways, and specifically to solve the challenges of climate change and the climate transition. So there will be huge infrastructure requirements that will require that capital to be mobilized. And we feel like as an important intermediary that touches, again, 20% of the world's financial assets, that is going to be one of the most important problems to solve, but a worthy one. The third is that, in general, markets have moved towards greater interoperability over the last several years. It is easier to trade in and out of equities, fixed income, sovereign notes of different markets today than it is even in the past. And with all the concerns that people have over China and its economy, it is still more connected into the global financial system today than it's ever been in the past. And we continue to believe there is more work happening behind the scenes to create that interoperability. And then finally, we believe that the digitization of financial markets is still in its early stages. Here in Japan, I think there have been some significant inroads made by the large Japanese banks, in some cases partnering with fintechs, sometimes going at it alone. alone to digitize their processes and to create better client experience. But the world in general is figuring out more ways to make that infrastructure of banking cheaper, better, faster, particularly as we think about how to incorporate the DeFi world, the decentralized finance world, into the traditional finance system. And so when you take all of that together, still sources of capital, but in dislocation, enormous demands in sort of societal ways through the climate transition, more inclusion happening through retail investing, greater interoperability of financial assets, though that goes in fits and starts, but the trend line is still positive. And then finally, this continued push towards digitization. These trends, we think, are not only going to persist, but accelerate even through this period.
Well, thank you. And you've referenced various asset classes. I'm curious of your thoughts on data as a new asset class, and with that, implications for the markets and for market participants, more broadly speaking.
Well, I think one thing is absolutely clear is that the world is demanding more transparency about where money is being deployed, how it's being used, and particularly in the case of the climate transition, is it working towards that goal or against it? And what that has done is created even more onus on clear, transparent, and public sources of information. And we believe that that data, its ownership, the providers who are going to establish it as part of the norms of how we look at it are still in the early stages of that. It will be a source of value and a new asset class, but I also think that it will feel like a public right. And that is going to be the competing tension that we'll have to manage, again, during this transition period.
Interesting. Thank you. That's very interesting. Well, we've spent a bit of time on the global backdrop, and I thought would be interesting to pivot towards Asia and spend a bit more time focusing on Asia and then on Japan specifically in the context of this conversation. Minister Yo, as the former Minister of Trade for South Korea, you have great insight into drivers to growth and economic activity in the Indo-Pacific region. I would welcome you to share your thoughts on opportunities that are arising from closer collaboration within the Indo-Pacific region and how that drives growth over the longer term.
Yes, thank you, Celeste, and also I'd like to thank to Eurasia Group for organizing this wonderful, really inspiring conference and inviting me to this conference. When we look at Asia, I think we see sort of a contrasting view of China versus the rest of the Asia. Chinese economy is a bit struggling with very draconian this zero COVID policy. Also some structural problem in the property market, and also really one of the lowest consumer domestic consumption and also consumer expectation. Whereas I think in other parts of Asia, it's slowly opening up as Japan, also slowly recovering, and then exports are picking up. So actually this morning, the Financial Times reported that interestingly, the Chinese growth, GDP growth, will fall behind the rest of Asia for the first time in I think 30 years. So I think it's really striking considering the rapid growth that Chinese economy has been really showing. And also when we look at Chinese the export to the United States for the first 7 months of this year, the Chinese export grew about I think 13%, but India's growth to U.S. market grew by 30%, and like Indonesia and the Bangladesh, 30 to 50%. So I think this is why this Indo-Pacific region is becoming important. Of course, it's no comparison to the sheer size of China, but this Indo-Pacific, especially this 10 Asian, the Southeast Asian market, also India, is very, very young. We talk about this demographic issue this morning, but they are very young. Their median age is like 30, only 30 or so. And then also the speed and the extent of digitalization in the Southeast Asia and India staggering. So that's why it's very important for us to really develop some new types of 21st century platform to address all these issues. Of course, we have this CPTPP and RCEP, especially Japan plays a very leading role in developing this CPTPP. But I think the paradigm of trade policy has changed, as we learned this morning. It's not more about this opening new market, but it's more about how to maintain this resilience of supply chain, how to promote this digitalization, how to incentivize this decarbonization and this climate change agenda into this international trading system. And none of this conventional trade agreement are well equipped to address all those issues. Mm-hmm. So I think we need really some sort of creativity and imagination to develop this IPEF, this new framework, into really 21st century, this GZERO world version of new governance system, as Prime Minister Kishida emphasized this morning. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And continuing on with the topic of IPEF, Governor Hayashi, what is your view on Japan's role and more specifically JBIC's role in supporting IPEF?
Well, thank you. Well, long before the advent of Belt and Road Initiative by China, Japan has been very active in supporting infrastructure in Asia, and Japanese companies have been in Asia investing in their supply chain. Mm-hmm. So East Asia has already developed a solid supply chains of trade and investment. But unfortunately, U.S. was trying to decouple China from U.S. But what happened actually was China decoupling itself because of zero COVID policy, and they also want to be self-independent in terms of goods and in terms of technology. So many companies, like it or not, although China continues to be a very attractive manufacturing base and consumption market, they have to find alternative supply chain or redundant supply chain in Vietnam or in other Asian countries. And well, IPEF is a network of cooperation among those countries who value openness, transparency, and rule of law to support supply chain resilience and also shift to cleaner energy. And as for JBIC, we have been supporting many Japanese companies, including SMEs, to invest in Asia. We are proud to have supported them. And also, they have exported our way of life, our working ethics, and the Japanese way of putting things tidy and all those things. So, and recently we have gone one step further by supporting in India, not just Japanese companies, but suppliers and dealers of Japanese car manufacturers. They are local Indian companies. And not only in developing countries or emerging countries, we're also active in developed countries because there is also move for nearshoring. So we are supporting semiconductor supply chain in US, in Germany, or in UK. So whatever it is, or wherever it is, the very globally important goods and technology and industrial base we want to support along with IPEF members.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, and specifically thinking about the tech supply chains and their importance to global growth and productivity, what do you see as the critical variables to the tech supply chains? What do you sort of envision there? What do you see as key?
Well, obviously semiconductors, EVs, those energy-related area is also very important. And every country is struggling to be ahead in terms of hydrogen and ammonia, new energy. So the energy supply chain, as I said. And as Mr. Ash said, digitalization is another important aspect of needed investment, where these two areas, supply chains and climate change, would be very much helped by investing in digital technology.
Yes, wonderful. And continuing along with the idea of IPEF, we certainly have talked a bit this morning and as part of this conversation about certain countries around the world coming together to build on and expand unique alliances really built around economic security and technological initiatives. In that context, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the Quad and its importance from a global perspective. And along the same lines, what are you thinking in terms of the sort of priorities for the Quad agenda in 2023? What stands out to you in that regard?
Yes. Well, before Quad, in the beginning was the trio. It was Japan and
right.
US and Australia. Trilateral collaboration in the South Pacific, where there were fierce battle during the Pacific War, but now it's a geopolitical rivalry. And but those countries in South Pacific, their life and their economic development does matter, and they are very vulnerable to the climate change and marine degradation and all those environmental effects. But if we put too much infrastructure on those islands, things what happened in Sri Lanka or in Hambantota port may happen in those countries. So we want to support them in the way that they can self-develop their economy and better the life of the human beings of those islands. Last year, we co-invested with a Japanese company in a utility, in a Fiji electric power company, because they want to be 100% renewable before 2036. So they need a lot of investment in power generation and in distribution. So that's what we do trilaterally. Now comes in India. It's a democracy, but very independent, very non-aligning. So we have to be very thankful to late Prime Minister Abe for his ideas and for his friendship with Prime Minister Modi. Yes. And also we have to be thankful with President Xi Jinping and the Chinese aggression to have India in the Quad. Well, India has been a very attractive country for many years, but that investment and development hasn't really happened to its potential. There's so much financial regulations and too rigid financial system. So conventional project financing is very difficult for us for many years. So, but India has to grow, and it has to also, well, its ambition is to be carbon neutral by 2070. And India doesn't want to be pressed by advanced countries to be decarbonize. Prime Minister Modi put it wisely to his Indian people that India has to be energy dependent, self-reliant. That's why he is putting more and more infrastructure investment in renewable energy. And how India develops, how clean development, green development, and inclusive development makes is an issue just not for India, but for us globally. So through Quad and through IPEF, we want very much support India. And we also want to tie up with India to support South Asian countries.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much. Akash, sort of continuing along this theme of expanding alliances, I wonder your thoughts on the GCC, certainly leveraging its strengths, specifically in the areas of as a supplier of energy. What do you see happening in the GCC in terms of diversifying its global economic relationships? And do you see any specific opportunities on which the GCC and Asia can collaborate?
No, I think the GCC is a good example of a place that still runs on a capital surplus and increasingly is not just an investor in the rest of the world, but also an investor in its own economy, which is a relatively recent trend. The GCC is a good example now of one that is using that investment to really build the infrastructure of its economy for the future. And one of the trends that we think is very exciting there is the focus on financial inclusion. So as a new emerging middle class develops in markets like Saudi Arabia, even in the Emirates and beyond, they're looking to have more ownership as part of their society than in the past. And so we see a lot of investment in the technology, governance, regulation to be able to do so. I think that allows those investors not only to invest more locally, but also globally. And it should be an opportunity for Japanese asset managers and others to provide products into that market. Also, as those economies look for more long-term sustenance beyond, beyond energy, I think they'll look for more broad and sweeping trade relations with the rest of the world. And so while the foundations of it will be energy-driven, they will go into more traditional manufacturing as well as information services. And I think that's another area where Japan is both a net exporter and an importer of those sorts of services and goods is in a great position. But I do believe this is a great mark of economies going through this enormous transition in a short period of time. Right. And for mature developed markets like Japan to take advantage of that, both for the purposes of Japan, but also for those markets as well.
Right. And another important trend we've seen is the GCC really gaining ground as a hub for the global financial system. You can see it in movement of capital, but movement of people as well, from major positions in the global financial institutions. How do you see the GCC's role in that respect advancing over time?
Well, as we spoke about this morning, I think, the global south is relatively underexplored and in the earliest stages still of the full sweeping opportunity in deepening its financial markets, diversifying their economies, and then integrating that in the world economy. And I think right now there's a race for where the hubs of this new global south are going to be. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a question here in APAC where that will be, whether it will be somewhere in Southeast Asia. Right now, the GCC is vying for that position that interconnects at least one member of the Quad and a few others. And so I think this is, again, a great reflection that free trade is it is processing through the system, not at the speed it should, not with the freedom that it should, but that mobility of capital and people is still a reflection that people are looking to be where the opportunity is.
Yes, sure. Thank you. And Mana-san, we've touched on energy and investment in energy, thoughts on climate change and sort of the urgency of the green transition. And Japan is certainly showing all signs of seeking to be a leader in decarbonization in Asia. Importantly, there is the GX bonds or the green transformation bonds. I'd welcome your thoughts on what Japan's plan is for those bonds going forward and see how you see that impacting the green transition.
Yes, thank you. I wonder whether Japan can lead Asian countries or not. However, maybe Mr. Hayashi said JBIC can lead our Asian countries' green market, maybe. However, several things confirm that Japan has ambitions to become an Asian leader in decarbonization. For example, in the summary of the FSA's meeting of experts on sustainability, they made that claim. And just a few days ago, Prime Minister Kishida's speech at the New York Stock Exchange declared that he would contribute to the development of GX investment in Asia. In May, Prime Minister made a speech at a panel of experts on clean energy strategy, stating that he would realize 150 trillion yen in public-private partnership investment in decarbonization field in at least 10 years. The main theme is how to use it as a source of growth. Of course, decarbonization requires money. So public funds are said to be 20 trillion yen. It is said that it will be issued as a GX economic transition bond. However, unfortunately, it's not yet clear what form it will take. However, if such a bond is to emerge as one of the JGB green bonds, it must have a solid framework. In the case of a transition bond, for example, we need a specific target, such as how much to reduce decarbonization by 2030, and a path toward achieving. If such a thing comes out, I think it will attract the interest of foreign investors to some extent. However, the other hand, it would take a long time to bring out a perfect product. And it is possible that we might not be able to do so until the end of 2030 or 2023 or 2024. From the perspective of foreign investors, it seems that Japan takes too long to implement its policies. It doesn't mean it won't happen this time either. So unfortunately, there are still too many uncertainties. So I would like to conclude my talk, but considering that this session titled New Hope, I'd like to say some kind of hope from my side. In this field, GX, there are expectations that Japan's technological capabilities can be demonstrated. Although we were unable to create GAFA or the FANG, there are many companies in Japan with excellent technology. I hope that many Japanese technologies for decarbonization will come to fruition from such companies, or small and medium-sized companies and local companies, and so on. And that they will be able to be exported overseas. I am convinced that doing so will help Japan's economic recovery and strengthen.
Right.
That's it.
Thank you very much. And Minister Yo, on the topic of the green transition and maybe zooming out beyond Japan and thinking about Asia more broadly speaking, one of the key pillars of IPEF is the clean economy. How, in your view, does this pillar sort of foster greater international collaboration on climate and decarbonization in Asia and even across the world?
I think this decarbonization pillar of IPEC will be really critical. One of the most critical factors of all IPEC, especially this WTO and this conventional international trading system was not designed to incorporate all these carbon factors into this system. So actually about a couple of years ago when European Union announced the introduction of this CBAM, cross-border adjustment system, adjustment mechanism, sorry. I think that really caused a lot of anxiety and concern in many of these manufacturers in Asia. Of course, I think it's a very meaningful step forward because we need to address this carbon leakage problem, in this cross-border trade of goods. But if each of these countries begin to introduce their own version of this kind of adjustment system, it could create additional barriers of trade barriers. So the ideal scenario is that develop this in a multilateral way. For example, WTO would be an ideal the venue to develop such a multilateral trading rule, incorporating the carbon factors, but it may take several years or even a decade. So this IPEF, this gathering of like-minded countries with some developed country and developing countries, how can we develop this kind of carbon adjusting system as a sort of new template for other countries. And also, I think also in IPEC they can create a mechanism when these companies from developed countries like Japan, Korea, and other countries in the region could go to these developing countries in South or Southeast Asia and do all this carbon mitigating project in a commercial the manner. So I think how to develop this kind of measures through IPEC would be very, very important.
Right. And obviously the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act, created a sort of a strategy or approach to investing in its green transition. Do you see any implications from the IRA for Asia?
Yes, I think the IRA is a big accomplishment. The most comprehensive, the really historic landmark climate bill. But also, I see this as a sort of a new version of America's industrial policy.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it caused a lot of the discomfort or the anxiety in Asian manufacturer, for example, EV vehicle. So the reason being is that I think the message that this IRA is giving is first, made in the U.S. Reshoring, you have to manufacture in the U.S. And second, you have to diversify. You have to diversify from China and then, so yeah, I think that's a right direction to go, but also I think you need to consider the reality on the ground that these companies are facing. For example, just one element of the EV vehicle, according to IRA, if consumers buy this EV vehicle manufactured in the U.S., you can get this $7,500 this tax credit. But also there's a lot of strings attached, very strong precondition. One of which is that these mineral materials you have to source in the U.S. or the FTA partners of the United States. So from 2023, you have to source 40% of the mineral in the U.S. or U.S. partner. But the reality that industry is facing, whether they are American companies or Japanese or Korean, for example, this cobalt, which is a key component, key material to this battery, 70% are mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right.
And about 70% are refined in China. So, I mean, it takes time to begin to diversify this concentrated source of this material, but just over a year, it's really challenging to bring it down to 40%. So, yes, I mean, the idea is great, but in order for this to be really utilized and the function as a real incentive, I think you need to put some of the reality into this IRA.
Yeah, no, certainly remains to be seen how it works, for sure. So we're coming down to the last few minutes. And again, I thought since our topic is really on the new hope, and we spend a lot of time talking about economic challenges, but also efforts at collaboration around the world, I thought I'd maybe spend 1 minute each just getting your feedback on your hope for world leaders to come together to collaborate in meaningful and consistent ways to help drive sustainable growth for this world. Really more of you. Do you think that's possible, Governor Yashi? Do you see that happening?
Well, I'm not quite sure we have lived up to the title New Hope. But let me start with what makes me hopeless.
Oh.
We've been talking about economic policy and financial markets, but it's politics, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it's about democracy in the United States.
Yes.
What happens if we have another populist, divisive president, and without Prime Minister Abe, who will be taming the shrew? That's my biggest concern. But fortunately, the good news is that we are not living in G1 or G2. We are living in G0, sort of. And there are multiple forums to talk about important things like G7, G20, APEC, RCEP, Quad, and IPEF. So there are many forums where heads of states, ministers, and CEOs have to come up. And in those stages, they feel they have to look good, cooperative. So we'll somehow want to manage to find a way out through those forums. And as I said, the policy this direction is very clear. We have to invest in climate change, other sustainability issues. We have to invest in supply chain resilience, and we have to invest in digital transformation. So the picture is very clear. And we also can collaborate with those countries whom we don't share value. Well, definitely not with Putin's Russia, but with China. China is benefiting so much from globalization, from this present economic structure. And China wants to be in TPP. It's a lifetime chance for us. They may not listen to you bilaterally, but surely multilaterally. So I'm not sure if Japan can be a leader, but I'm sure we can play a major role in these discussions to make you hopeful. Thank you.
So you're ending up on a hopeful note. Thank you. Akash, your thought. You feel that there's any momentum here?
I am excited about what the next generation of leaders are going to do, both in the public sector, which is back home in the U.S., starving for that next generation to come in, but also in the private and social sectors as well. And I believe that generation, as it takes the helm, will work from a point of curiosity and optimism that is so needed in this world, and will have the skills to manage through multiple crises and resilience that's needed for it. So that's what makes me really optimistic. In the very short term, what's really important is for that generation to manage through this period, which is a bit unusual, right? This is the first time for them that we're going to live in a resource-constrained and perhaps deglobalized world. Mm-hmm. But that makes me, short-term pessimist, but long-term optimistic.
That's great. Well, thank you. And I don't know, Mana-san, if you have any thoughts on your view. You're a credit analyst, so you're always negative.
Yes,
but,
and also we have no time. However, my conclusion is that same as both of them. However, I think in the short term, we should focus on the climate change, sustainable finance, and decarbonization. If we can utilize those, we can change the world. And also, as a Japanese, we can utilize those as economical recovery and also the strength in Japanese economy. That's it.
Yeah. Actually, I want to find new hope from middle power countries. I think in this kind of GZERO world, waiting for leadership by big powers seems to be not a realistic option. But I think these middle power countries can exert a very constructive, open-minded leadership. Let me take an example of CPTPP, how it started. It started from P4 country. It's a very small, there's countries in the region. And then when Mexico, Canada, Japan joined, it just blossomed into really big, this mega free trade agreement. And also when the US left, the Japan really filled the blank, left by the United States. So I think it's time for really kind of middle power countries like Japan, Korea, and others to really step up and then really try to play a constructive leadership role.
Yes. Let's hope. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel.